So list criteria. This is a very important part of the subject. So now you know where to go and buy the list. Now the key is, how will you filter the list? Now you don't just get a regular old list. You actually have to take and give them some criteria. You have to tell them what type of list you want, how you want to filter the list. Because if we were to just go buy a list of random people who in, say, 21225 owned homes, then our list would be huge. We might get 50,000 people. The problem with that list is that we don't know or have any, there's nothing suggesting that they might want to sell their property. So what we always focus on in our list is, number one is an absentee owner, and this is where I like to start my list. And I also put next to this non-LLC. So you would have probably heard me talk about this in the previous slides. And the reason I say that you want to work with non-LLC is because the first thing to prove to you that someone is a weekend landlord or more of a recreational landlord is that they put it in their personal name. That's generally when somebody owns property in their personal name as an investment. It pretty much says that they're not professional landlords. So this is the type of person we want to work with. They generally have pain because when they're not professional landlords, then they're having all the problems of being a landlord, like people not paying or, asking for repairs. I mean, all kind of crazy things that happen to landlords without any of the benefits because they're not doing the things that are really awesome. And this usually is it's very easy to figure out who these people are by getting a list of absentee owners and then just cutting out any LLCs. Now, LLCs is the first sign that, okay, maybe they're professional, maybe they're not. But the key is, if they have an LLC, it's at least a first step towards them being more professional. The next piece is that they've owned their home for at least 15 years. Now, we're sitting at 2018 as I'm recording this. 15 years ago was 2000, let me make sure I get this right, 2002, 2003. Now, there was a really big change in the market around 2005, 2006, where people bought their properties and paid way too much for a couple years. And then we had this huge drop in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. Now the market's starting to come back. We've pretty much recovered back to what things were worth like 2006 and 7. With that being said, somebody buying their house just 10 years ago would land you at 2008. We really don't want to market to people who bought their house in 2008 because 2008 means they likely pay too much or owe too much at this current time. So right when we had a big change, right before 2005, and I'll give an example. Before 2005, if you took a house in Glen Burnie, you could buy in 2003, that house would go for about $99,000. Now, by just a few years later, by 2005 and 6, that same house was going for $225,000. That's how big of an increase we had. So if you really think about this, if you go 15 years back as an absolute minimum, that it's at least 15 years old, then you're going to get only people who bought their house back when it was, maybe they bought it for $100K. If they didn't refi it, then they're going to have plenty of equity in it, which gives us an opportunity to buy a house with good equity in it. So we always like that, because here's the thing. Even if you were to get a list of people that bought a house 2 years ago, but maybe they paid cash and they had 100% equity in it, people mentally don't like to sell their homes for less than what they paid for it. So you're not just looking for equity, but you're looking for equity, but you're also looking for someone who has a really reasonable expectation of what to sell their property for. And most people's expectation of what their property is worth is at least the minimum of what they paid for it. So if we can get back to 2003 when people were paying much better numbers, their expectations are more realistic, and we're not going to have high expectations. We'll commonly get calls from people who bought houses in 2008 and they'll be like, I think my house is worth 200. In reality, it's worth like 130, 140, and they just overpaid for it because they bought it at a really hot time. So 15 years is our minimum, and what this is 15 plus. So at the minimum, you've had to own your house 15 years, but all the way up to as long as they've tracked. So, if somebody owned their house 30, 40 years, that's even better. Now, 50% equity is the next piece. We keep this really simple, but this means that they have 50% equity in their house. How they track this, you might wonder, how do we know if they have 50% equity? So they look at what the mortgage is on the property in comparison to what it's tax assessed for. So if it's tax assessed for $200K and the mortgage is like $100K, they would consider that to be 50% of the $200K assessment. This isn't perfect, but what this does do, it makes sure that there's a difference between how much is the tax assessed for and what the mortgage is. And that's a really good starting point, because what we don't want is something that's assessed for $200K 200K and the mortgage is 225, that would very unlikely have good equity in it and have the ability for them to sell it to us at a cheap price. So we always want to make sure people can sell to us. That's one of our key things when we're talking to people, that we might be able to use every technique in the book, but if they don't have the ability to sell, then it's very little chance they will. The next is the tax value of 50 to 250K. I personally use this because I don't want to see houses that are tax assessed at $5,000. That's going to be too rough of a neighborhood. It doesn't have, a very good standing. It's probably a little bit dangerous. Really, there's not a lot of people buying and selling in that neighborhood. I also don't want something that's tax assessed for $600,000 because that's going to be just way too good of a neighborhood. And we're not going to see a lot of flipping going on there. This 50 to 250 for the Baltimore region represents the first-time homebuyers market for me and a landlord's market. So if I buy something for 50 and put 30 in, that might be a great landlord property that we can rent for like 15, 1600 a month. Or if we get something that's worth like 150K and put 50 in, sell it for like 300, that's a really good first-time home buyer in a good neighborhood. So these are the areas that this is going to be our kind of our wheelhouse for Baltimore. Now, if you're in California, it's going to be a lot higher in some areas. And if you're in some Midwest states, it might be lower. The key is figure out what price point are good rentals and landlords selling properties for, and where are the first-time home buyers, and then make sure you're creating a criteria that goes to the minimum and goes to the maximum, but cuts out all the stuff that would just be too cheap or way too expensive, because you don't want to waste your money sending letters to people that aren't going to usually be a good fit. Built 40 years ago. So this means that the house is at least 40 years old. In my experience, now this is something depending on where you are, you might have to adjust this. But in my experience here in Maryland, we have houses on average that are built in like the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are really going to be good houses for us. As soon as we get into the 70s and 80s, the house ends up being so new that we really can't get a good deal on it. Now, this just isn't true in other states. So I want you to take this with a grain of salt. If say you're in, like I have a friend in Sacramento and he only does houses that are 20, 30 years old. You'll see in Vegas, you'll see things that are very new. In Florida, you'll see a lot newer properties. So just depending on where your key, your key area will be and where you're seeing a lot of things sell, figure out what that is and make sure that you're not buying stuff that's brand new. What we don't want to do is send a letter to a house that maybe is 15 years old, because that house probably is not going to be in bad shape yet, and they're not really going to have any value to sell it to us. So in general, we want to mail to people. If you're in an area where most things are very new, then maybe at least 20 to 25 years old. For us here in Baltimore, we're always like 40 years old. So we know that 1975, anything really newer than that, it's going to be tough for us to get a good deal on it because it likely isn't in good enough shape. And we might even be able to take that down to like 35 years. But in general, just make sure you're not going so new that you're getting crazy new houses that need no work. Then 8 to 1,800 square feet. Now, again, this is very specific to where you live, but I could say throughout the country, 800 to 1,800 square foot would really represent a first-time home buyer's house. So if that's the case in your neighborhood, then I would use this criteria, because it doesn't make sense to send out mailers to houses that are 2,900 square feet, 5,000 square feet. They're just not going to be great flip houses usually. And again, don't take me word for word on this. I don't want anybody coming back and saying, Mike, but you could make a lot of money with a house that's 3,500. I'm not saying don't do 3,500. So the key to this is, if you've ever heard of the saying, don't step over over dollars to get the pennies. That's what you're doing. If you're worried about that one deal you might miss here, you're likely going to get inundated with $1 million properties and junk properties, or properties that are too small or too big. We really want to stay focused and master the size and the area and the age that is commonly going to work. That doesn't mean we won't sometimes get a 3,000 square foot house that's 15 years old. We do. It just doesn't represent very often for me. Of 1,100 houses, it represents about 1 to 2% of the houses I've done. So when I'm marketing, I always want to market to the 99%, not to the 1-2%. It just doesn't make sense to do so. We end up wasting, if you think about all the money you waste sending to these people, knowing that you're not going to get these deals very often, it compounds over the years to be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it could be the difference in you making it or not making it.